Today is June 28th, 2016. Kay Wagner, Foundation Archivist, is talking with Dr. Michael Hartigan, a retired pediatrician. Dr. Hartigan attended medical school at the State University of New York, Upstate Medical Center in Syracuse, New York. He graduated in 1963, and he completed a summer fellowship at Woods Hole Marine Biological Laboratory in 1960, and his residency at Ohio State University and Columbus Children's Hospital. He joined Gunderson Health System in 1969 and retired part-time in 2003 and full-time 3 years after that. Welcome today. We're glad to have you here.
Thanks, Kay.
Hopefully I got everything correct in the introduction.
So far, so good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, now it's your turn to tell us about your family history, where you grew up, your education, training.
I grew up in Fort Wayne, Indiana, my first 16 years. And my dad was with General Electric, so we moved from there to Pennsylvania, then to New York. But anyway, you cut it, I'm a transplanted Hoosier. So I was high school there, then undergraduate was at Indiana University. And after 3 years, I'd met all the requirements to go to IU med school, and I decided, I've been prepared for medical school, but I hadn't been educated. So I had the most wonderful senior year at IU, taking all the things that I loved. Everything from theater to philosophy, logic, history of Christian thought, all the things that add a little breadth to both what you stand for and how you treat people. Then off to, since we lived in New York, then that's what got me to medical school in upstate. And then to Ohio State Children's Hospital, which is now a nationwide hospital. And it was interesting in upstate. Most of the fellow students were from downstate. And literally, that's where I learned that there's no more provincial people than the people from the east. If they came across the East River, they are out west. And when I decided to go to Columbus, they thought it was just bizarre that I was going to be with the Native Americans and cooking over a campfire, I guess. But my mentor in pediatrics at Syracuse was Bob Shapiro, one of the finest, not only physician, but finest human beings I'd ever met. And I thought, if Columbus Children's can train Bob Shapiro, they ought to be able to do something for Michael Hartigan. So that's why I interviewed there, and among other things, places where I interviewed, there was no doubt once I interviewed that's where I was going to be. Loved my years there. Stayed an extra year as chief resident, which was one of the most wonderful years, because you got to, you literally take all the cream off the top of the interesting patients and plan conferences, and it was a wonderful year and great residents. Then Uncle Sam found out where I lived, and I spent a couple of years in the Air Force. And I think because I took an extra year, because it was in what was called the Berry Plan at that time, which is no longer extant, which guaranteed you the completion of your residency as a trade-off for guaranteed time in the service of your choice, and I happened to choose the Air Force. I guess primarily because I thought there were some really nice assignments in the United States Air Force, and that's what the heck, let's serve in an interesting part of the world. But when I took an extra year to be chief resident, the chief of pediatrics had to work through Sam Devine, who at that time was senator from Ohio, to get me an extra year because I'd obligated myself to the Air Force. And I think somebody in Washington didn't like that, because then I spent my Air Force career in Minot, North Dakota. But Minot was fun. But it was a very interesting place. Called it the land of the horizontal snow. I was chief of pediatrics at the John Moses Hospital. And then I started looking for a place to practice during the last year in the Air Force. And there were numerous things. I was entertaining solo group, small group, large group. I would look at any option. And they'd invited me back to complete my neonatal fellowship, which was brand new at the time at Ohio State. And suddenly the hierarchy of the university and the Air Force started to look a lot alike, and I knew I was not cut out for the Air Force. So now I was at odds. What am I going to do? So I looked at various practices, small, large. Saw the ad for the Gunderson Clinic in the New England Journal of Medicine. Had no idea where La Crosse was, but it sounded interesting. Corresponded with Rolf Slungard, who at that time was head of pediatrics. Came for an interview. Could not believe that I could practice potentially subspecialty medicine in a town of, at that time, of about 50,000. Unheard of. I had thought that this transplanted Hoosier was going to have to be in the metropole someplace. And that, so that was a dilemma. But when I saw this opportunity, I just never looked back. And Rolf and the folks here really made me feel at home. I was a little leery because there were 11 Gundersons working at the time, and I was number 65. Well, I thought, well, I'm not coming here to be somebody's apprentice, so I'll give myself 2 years, and then I'll decide whether I stay or not. And there was never a doubt that and the wisdom of the uncles to divest the family of the control and make it corporate control was such a wise and premature decision. It was really premature, meaning that they were ahead of the times. And after the model of the Mayo brothers, took their lead, I think, from that, and what a wise decision. Here we are today, sitting in this magnificent place. That got me here, got me started, and finished my neonatal fellowship through the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and we were off and running.
You said earlier that it sounded as if you were saying that you knew that you wanted to go into medicine, but you hadn't learned, or something to that effect. And
yeah, it's interesting when you're growing up and trying to figure out what you want to do, and of course, as you finish high school, everybody's asking you, what are you going to do? Well, you need an answer. So I said, well, I'm good at science. I'm good at math. I love people. Medicine, I suppose, is it. But interesting as I look back on it, that had nothing to do with it. That was the naivete of a teenager trying to figure out what he wanted to do. I was destined to do what I did. The year before I was born, I had an older brother, Bobby, who died. And my folks never understood what they went through until I could look back at my profession, and there was not a doubt that the reason I ended up in healthcare was Bobby. Never knew Bobby, never met him, but he was always a member of the family. And I didn't realize how hard that is for parents to do that. It'll tear people apart, It'll bring some together, but to make that individual just a member of the family for the rest of their lives was an incredible gift. And I didn't realize how tough that was until I got interested in the grieving and bonding process in neonatology, which was one of my major interests. So why did I end up doing what I do? Bobby. Yeah.
Did he die at birth?
No, he was 6 years old, and ironically, he died in 36, very near the time that penicillin hit the market. Now, whether he had bacterial or viral pneumonia, who knows? But it's rather ironic. There were limited resources to deal with pneumonia at any age in those years. But the steadfastness of my parents, I just been forever grateful.
Sounds like it was a wonderful family,
Yeah,
despite the tragedy.
yeah.
It also sounds as if your parents were probably close to being role models to you as much as the Bob Shapiro that you mentioned in some ways.
Oh boy, yeah. My mom was a math teacher, and when I was growing up, she didn't teach full time, but she'd substitute. I was always embarrassed to tears when she came to my math class and was a substitute teacher. But she's the one that pretty well kept me on the straight and narrow. Dad was an engineer out of Kansas State. Mom had gone to University of Nebraska in the 20s. That was a little unusual for women to be college graduates coming out of the 20s. And she went to Nebraska. Dad went to Kansas State, came out as an electrical engineer, and worked for General Electric for 52 years. The principles, and I already mentioned one, I guess, earlier, that the lessons I learned from my dad have been also just paramount. As an example, we talked about retirement, and probably the best lesson I ever had about retirement was, he said, don't ever retire from something. He said, retire to something. I always remember that, never forget it, and it's true. The other thing he said, you'll know when the time is right, and you do. You know when it's time to turn it over to younger, brighter folks, and those lessons were great. I probably learned a lesson from my dad that may it served me well on one hand, but it was costly on another, and that is, Dad worked with General Electric right up through my early years, and of course that was World War II as I was growing up, so I didn't see much of my dad. Worked 7 days a week, defense contracting. And so to that extent, I learned the lessons of being a workaholic, and that's one of my shortcomings. And yet it's on the one hand, it's a blessing because, wow, what you can get done, what you can accomplish, but there's a price to pay. And so working every other night for a lot of years here, that was wearing. That wears on you, and does. It just takes a toll. You're fatigued most of the time. But the other thing that was interesting, Dad didn't make many of my ball games or my track meets or any of those kind of things. The fascinating thing is when he did, I'd probably the biggest success was probably in baseball. And when he would make one of the games, he never never shouted. He wasn't a shouter and wasn't a rah-rah guy. But I could pick his voice out of a crowd. Yeah. It was, well, one game I remember. It was I don't even remember where it was, but there was a, "Come on, Hartigan." That's all I heard. All I heard. The rest of the crowd didn't hear a thing. Nobody else heard it either because it wasn't very loud. But also the lesson that you can accomplish amazing things if you don't care who gets the credit. If you're worried about the credit, you're on the wrong track. And that I think that's paid off as well. I've been very fortunate. I know that. I was fortunate growing up. I've been fortunate in my profession. Fortunate to find lacrosse. And fortunate also, one of the wonderfully rewarding lessons in life is that we have a blended family, and all of the kids, Vicky's, mine, Holly's from the time we were together before she died, all of the kids call our place home, which is just amazing. What a tribute to Vicky, because she stepped in a tough situation where, other than your own daughters, not many people are looking forward to liking you very much, but she made it happen.
How many children?
Altogether, there's 7. I have 3 sons. She has 2 daughters, and Holly had 2 daughters. And we have 12 grandchildren, which is absolutely sheer delight. You can have all the fun and darn little of the responsibility, which is great.
Did you say that you had 2 other brothers that were engineers?
I had one other brother.
Okay.
My dad was an engineer, and my eldest brother, Dick, was an engineer out of Purdue, and of course he and I fought about the old oaken bucket till the day he died with IU and Purdue. And he was in quality control, and lived in various places of the country. And he was, since Dad wasn't available, and Dick was 9 years my senior, he was the one that taught me how to pitch a ball, how to play basketball, how to camp, how to fish, how to read the rapids in the creek that ran behind our place. So he was kind of my dad figure for a while, because Dad just wasn't available. And yet, interesting, I still remember, even though I was, well, from 41 on, I was between 4 and 10 during the Second World War, and we lived in the country, had a long lane, and the old cars were really fun. But Dad would phone as he left Fort Wayne, and we lived 8 miles out, so it was about 20 minutes for him to make his way home. And once he called, I was at the end of the driveway, and I'd hop on the running board, and in we'd ride into home, hanging on to the old post that used to be between the little window and the big window in the front door, hanging on the running board, going like the wind. And that was our time. That was our time. Yeah.
I'd forgotten about your wife, that Holly. I don't know if you care to share about that.
Yeah, it was all too short. He died of breast cancer, and that was life-changing. Yeah. Again, it gives you respect for those folks that have to endure that, both the dying and those that remain. Yeah. And interestingly enough, my mom's mother died when she was 13, and Holly's daughter Shannon was 13. So my mom and Shannon hit it off big time, just because they had something in common. Yeah.
How old was Holly when she died?
Oh, mercy. You know, I've forgotten. No, I don't recall. I think late 50s. But yeah, certainly too soon. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, we'll move on to some things about Gunderson now.
Yeah.
Unless you have anything else that you care to share about family.
No, I think that covers it well, and it may be like the little boy that goes to the library and gets this huge tome. You may have learned more about my family than you wanted to learn.
Absolutely not. It enriches the interview, I believe. Thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome.
Well, you told us how you first heard about Gunderson. You told us about you were number 65, and you also mentioned you were among the first non-Gunderson members recruited. Was that challenging?
Well, it was, especially since Cameron was in the Department of Pediatrics, and that's why I didn't come with a chip on my shoulder. I came just wary that with all the preparation, I didn't come to plan to be anybody's apprentice, and I was totally satisfied that the folks that were in charge of the clinic had one thing in mind, and that was the quality of care, and that rang true, and that still rings true today. Never once did I feel that the family was making any imposition, which I thought was really that was amazingly generous. As I mentioned before, at a time that it was had to be difficult for them to make that decision to approach the broader aspects of healthcare. Yeah.
I think it was Dr. Jerome that was talking about endless discussions around the dinner table.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah.
Well, pediatrics has probably evolved considerably since you started practice. What would, in your mind, be the greatest innovation?
There, in the newborn area, the newborn arena, which was in the 60s and during my training was the understanding of fetal and neonatal physiology was really emerging, and it was so exciting that when I finally then came to practice and finished the neonatal fellowship, to then undertake regionalization, which meant a lot of interesting things. It was the wisdom of Stan Graven, who at that time was professor of neonatal medicine in Madison, who said, you know, centers like the Gunderson Clinic and like La Crosse that has great health care, those are the places we ought to have centers of excellence in all things, and in particular neonatal, which was very new the whole concept of neonatology. It was a new word, as a matter of fact. And so we undertook that, outreach to all the hospitals, all the clinics, offering transport and tri-state ambulance service, being very not only cooperative but collaborative in that effort. They were excited about it. And the amazing thing, when we started that, the neonatal death rate was 17 per 1,000 live births. Not only nationwide, I mean, Wisconsin fit right in. After 2 years of operation, of regionalizing care and transferring the sickest in here, it was 8 deaths per 1,000 live births. That was the most incredible advance since antibiotics. It was subtle. There wasn't a huge amount of fanfare, but it was an incredible happening to make that occur and to be part of that revolution, if you will. The early questions in neonatology were what if only we could this or that, or if only we had smaller stuff, endotracheal tubes, IV access, needles. If we only had micro techniques in the lab. There were blood studies we couldn't do on the newborn because the lab required 2 cc's of blood. Seems like a small amount, but if you're 1.5 pounds, that's a lot of blood. So with the advent of micro techniques, with the advent of smaller endotracheal tubes, with the advent of better ventilators, with a better understanding of the physiology of both the fetus and the newborn, together with the perinatal folks that were taking remarkable care of mom and fetus on their trip to end up in the NICU. That collaboration and was really one of the most exciting times, certainly in pediatrics. Just since I'm a rabble-rouser in general, the other thing was in general pediatrics. Since I was so committed to neonatal care, but they wanted you to stay in touch with your specialty, namely pediatrics. So I had a general practice of pediatrics, which I loved. But there were demands that pulled you in both directions, and there are times that you just had to bail out because the sickest demanded your first attention. And I learned about this concept of pediatric nurse practitioners. And suggested to the department, that would be great for us to work with nurse practitioners, and that way a lot of the things that we do can be shared. Well, that didn't go over very well. Physicians are a little loath to give up some of the things that have historically been doctors' prerogatives. So I had a sales job on my hands. Wasn't quite sure how that was going to fare. So finally it dawned on me that this is basic mathematics. I said, guys, let me just do me a favor. Hear me out. If A is the quality of care that I give, and B is the quality of care that you give, and A and B are equal, do you agree on that? Sure. Yeah, we all agreed. I said, now if C is my care plus a nurse practitioner, C is greater than A, therefore it's greater than B. Let me tell you, they didn't like to hear that. So they did allow me, and the executive committee allowed me to approach Diane Lynn-Smith. And she said, wow, I'm up for this. So courtesy of the clinic, was sent off for that kind of training. She returned. She and I worked together for years. But it wasn't too long before we were working together that at our department meetings it started to come up, maybe we need another nurse practitioner. And before you knew it, all of us were working with nurse practitioners. That's one of the things I'm probably proudest of as far as the general pediatric department. Love the guys I worked with, but boy, I'll tell you, there are some times that we had some just short of fisticuffs over the bargaining table to decide a direction for the department.
And I think pediatrics was the first department that had a nurse practitioner.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, Diane provided me with the history of it, and I think that the whole concept came out of a nurse in Colorado.
I think so. Yeah. No, that's a familiar chord. Yeah.
I can't remember her name, but I did a little bit of research on that. Well, going on then, you've also actively been involved in institutional roles, chairman of the Personnel Committee, Board of Directors for both the Department of Pediatrics and La Crosse Lutheran Hospital Foundation, as well as medical advisor for Resolve Through Sharing, just to name a few. What are some of the memories you have of your involvement with both the hospital and the clinic?
I think the excitement was not only as group practice grew and the potential for the quality of care that you can deliver in a group became totally evident that the quality of care that you can deliver with the concept of group practice and a group practice intimately associated with a hospital was an incredible way to practice, and it was not the norm for Wisconsin. It was not the norm for the country. There was a handful of places where that could occur, but it became clear that to me, in my opinion, that is a superior way to deliver care. So to be part of the boards of those organizations, it was as revealing as it was related to anything I could contribute.
You were also involved in outreach efforts. Talk about that. You did that. You did a little bit before, but continue along that line.
Had an opportunity given to be a delegate to the Sister City organization to befriend Dubna, Russia. And together with that group, the leadership of that group was Chuck Hansen, and he was a friend and invited us to be part of that delegation representing healthcare. And a little leery at the time. Dubna, Russia won. We were unaware of that, so I learned a lot in a hurry about Dubna, but Russia was an adversary and had been a significant adversary during all the Cold War. So I had feelings about, I'm not sure how this is going to go. So we made plans, took lessons at TC in Russian. Have always felt that if I travel to a foreign country, the least I can do is to respect them, to at least be polite in their language, even though I can't converse anything heavy. So we had basic Russian, and we then were going to fly to Dubna. And so we flew initially from New York to Helsinki on Finnair, then from Helsinki we got on Aeroflot. Well, I wasn't sure the wheels were going to stay on that aircraft. It was startling to me that an aircraft would be in that kind of shape. But we flew to what was then Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. And as we exited the plane on the tarmac, we thought, whoa, we walked through this cordon of troops with carbines drawn. And I thought, boy, we're not in Kansas anymore. And we were met there by a delegation from Dubna, the friendliest, the most hospitable, the most gracious people that I had ever had the opportunity to meet. That it was in stark contrast to the formality of the airport and security. And then they bussed us to Dubna, hosted by their families, and we embarked on making the articles of sister cityhood, but more importantly, made the contacts with the hospitals and the physician to start a 10 to 12 year project on healthcare. And together with a good friend, Walter Vallejo, who at the time worked at St. Francis as an endocrinologist, he really approached the area of diabetes control, which was incredible. That here is what seemed like it was a first world country who had really second world healthcare and infrastructure. Incredible that there were periods of time when the lights would go out in town, and Dubna is a city where it didn't exist on the maps for years. Russians never put it on the map because that's where they built aircraft, and it was a nuclear research town. And of course, with the age of satellites, that becomes silly. I mean, so sure, there's that town right there, and here's what's going on there. So we met people from the research lab. We met people that were in business, that ran the city, and we were hosted in their homes and so graciously treated. And then started the most important part of the project, which was an exchange. They came here, we went there. What a brilliant way of person-to-person diplomacy, and that really is I think a tribute to the wisdom of Sandy McCormick, who to this day is highly invested in international relations and is an expert in that area. She shepherded us, all of us, through that relationship, and then the Russians and we, who hopefully were equally hospitable. And there's some wonderful stories, both funny and serious, about that relationship with the folks. And I still have friends in Dubna. I regret not having been back there for years. Now, the medical project ended, but Dubna literally became this island that initially Moscow looked toward as threatening. What are they doing up there that maybe we're not doing, except in Hospital 1, which was their elite hospital in Moscow. The rest of the hospitals were 1940s style. And finally they realized that once they came and saw what they were doing in Dubna, many of the things that we were doing in Dubna in terms of teaching neonatal resuscitation, in terms of diabetic care, and so on, became models, and that they were wise to take those models and spread them throughout Russia. Had an opportunity, by virtue of those contacts, a few years later, to be invited to go to Siberia. And when they asked me to go, I said, as long as I have a two-way ticket, that's number one. And number two, listen, let me be honest with you. I only have two interests in Siberia. One, that I've been fascinated by the Trans-Siberian Railroad. And two, one of the great lakes in the world is Lake Baikal. I said, so if I can have a chance maybe to touch those, yeah, I'd be interested. They said, well, will it make a difference if we say that this project is in Ulan-Ude, Buryatia, which is on the shores of Lake Baikal? And I said, count me in. And it's another one of those life changers. I've been very fortunate to have some episodes that literally shape and mold your thinking and the love of people around the world. It was a marvelous experience teaching neonatal resuscitation and also certain aspects of pediatric intensive care in a hospital in Ulan-Ude. And of course got the chance to see and spend some time on Lake Baikal, which was just magnificent. Yeah. That bug kind of well, it bit me. It didn't bite Vicky quite so hard, because I came home one day and said, Vic, there's an opportunity with Rotary to be what's called Rotary International Volunteers. She said, that sounds interesting. I said, well, what do you think of Bangladesh? She looked at me like I was stark raving mad, and I may have been. But long story short, we trained at UC Davis for a couple of weeks, and then flew to Dhaka and then on to Chittagong, which is right on the Bay of Bengal, and worked in a children's hospital. That's a euphemism, because it was for the street kids. They had nothing, absolutely nothing. If they had to come in the hospital, they would find their way to the hospital. Parents would bring them, and they had to bring their own bedding and provide everything. About the only thing they had was a pump outside. It's an old military barracks that was taken over. That was probably the first time I had come, or we had come, and had to address, you couldn't look away, people dying in the street. You know, we have hunger in this country. We don't know starvation. There was a med school actually in Chittagong, but they didn't come to Shishu Hospital. The residents didn't come there. So they invited me to lecture in neonatal care, because they had none of that at the med school. So I did that. I said, I will do that under one condition, that you send your residents to help out at Shishu Hospital. Oh yeah, we'll do that. Well, you have to realize everything's a deal in probably a lot of places in the world, probably even in our country, but you got to make a deal. I don't think they had any intention of sending the residents there. But again, they finally did. We had some great teaching rounds that were really, really exciting. And when we first arrived, Vic and I were both basically in tears. We said, what on earth can you do here? When we got through the tears, and you finally realize we can't do much, but let's do what we can. And then it became okay. Then it became okay. There's kind of a philosophic problem from the standpoint that Bangladesh has the landmass area of about Wisconsin, and we have, 6 million people? Bangladesh has 120 million people. You can't feed that many people. And so the philosophic question is, what are you doing saving these children? And we were asked that. And you have to search your soul and understand that generosity and love aren't necessarily universal. And you at that point, again, like the story of the starfish, it may not make a dent, but it'll matter to that person, to that baby, that youngster. That's what it's all about. I'm not sure it's a lesson that weighs heavily in a country that has 120 million people, with people starving in the street. So I understand the dilemma, but it wasn't a dilemma for us.
Interesting. Mm-hmm. Interesting experience. When you say that it was a life changer, in what way?
Life is fragile. Good heavens, it's fragile. And it changed the way you think about both adversity and opportunity. There was an interesting feeling when you return from that. There was almost a sense of guilt walking into the grocery store, of walking down the street, being safe, about having clean water and clean air. In the distribution of how toxic a maldistribution of wealth can be. In Bangladesh, 95% of the wealth was held with about 4 to 5% of the people. And we'd made contact because any medicine for Shishu Hospital were gifts, were given. They were just given. So you had to hustle. And I admire the head physician there. She really did her best to hustle. And with the huge amount of pollution, with all those people and all the tuk-tuks that spew out this blue smoke there, look like a little motor scooter, and they're made to haul the driver and 2 people. Well, they'd have 5 people, 2 goats, and a bale of straw. And they'd belch out this smoke, and obviously hadn't cared for the engines at all, and everything was polluted. So that after a while, your eyes burned, and everybody wheezed. So Vic, as a respiratory therapist, said, it'd be so easy to deal with this if we just had inhalers. So we contacted the companies that made albuterol and said, you're making so much money off of that stuff. You need to help these folks out. He said, okay, we have a rep in Dhaka, which is the capital of Bangladesh, so back up from, we called that individual, and he said, sure, meet me in my hotel, and we'll talk. Well, we're still in our work clothes, our cutoffs and everything else, so we were going up there to meet him. To give you an idea of the wealth, when he said, meet me at my hotel, it was his hotel. So we were shown in this grubbies into the boardroom, sat down with all these suits, and talked about giving albuterol to Shishu Hospital. And they were magnanimous. They gave us amazing amount of albuterol. Interestingly then Vicki would take it to the hospital, and they thought she was a white goddess, because these kids would come in wheezing and hacking, and the adults would, and she'd show them how to use an inhaler, and they'd walk out breathing free. Holy cow! You cannot imagine that it was, to them it was magic. The med school got a hold of that and said, "Oh, you need to come to the med school." We said, "That's fine, we'll come to the med school." They said, and by the way, bring that supply of albuterol." We said, "Not a prayer. Not a prayer are we going to bring that there. You can find your own ways. You're well connected. These kids and this physician who is doing her best to run a hospital for the street children don't have a prayer unless it's donated." And so we went to the med school and demonstrated it, and they were duly impressed, and then we told them how to get their own supply. So but everything's a deal. I mean, you gotta have something to trade, or you aren't going anywhere in Bangladesh. And I guess that's true any place in the world, but.
Interesting. And Sandy's still...
Oh, she's going strong, yeah. I admire that. That's, yeah.
How was Dubna initially picked as the city to partner with?
That's a good question. That's I'm not sure I can recall, but it may, I don't know if it had to do at that time with Sandy's contacts or how that contact came to be, but because it was about our size, and it was on 2 rivers and a canal. It was on the Volga. Exciting to see the Volga. Never thought that in this lifetime I'd see the Volga, which was magnificent. And then the canal, the Dubna-Moscow Canal, that was dug at the cost of thousands of lives by Stalin. And then the lake at the headwaters and the river that flows into that. So we had that in common. Size-wise, we had it in common. They had 2 reasonably sized hospitals, neither of which were, again, when you look at it, I recall walking down the hall at Lutheran Hospital outside Jack Schwemm's offices, were a whole wall of pictures of the way the hospital used to be in its early days. I thought I was walking through that hospital there. And they were bright folks, but they had such limited resources because it was all controlled out of Moscow. But they were savvy. They knew, one of the first things out of their mouths was, how do we get a CT scanner? They couldn't power a CT scanner if they took every electron in the city of Dubna. So you had to tell them, you got wiring, you got plumbing, you got to start with the basics. You got to build to that. I know we know you need that, but you can't provide it.
Infrastructure.
Exactly. The infrastructure was shut. The roads were almost beyond belief. And at night, they drive with their lights dimmed. Well, and you always have a driver when you're there. Somebody's always your driver. Well, they know the roads. So you'd be driving down the street, and all of a sudden you'd swerve, and you'd look, was there a dog or a cat or something? Nah, it was a big, huge pothole. You go swerving down the street, and you think, oh my gracious, I don't know if I'm going to survive this. But the power, a lot of it ran on steam, the power plant, and then they'd have these pipes above ground with this thick insulation, and would run steam through it, and that would heat various places. Well, the insulation's fallen off these pipes. I mean, there was incredible waste, and there were times when people said, we don't have heat this week. The same way with lights. The lights didn't work all the time, and that, thankfully, they've done remarkable job in Dubna. It really is classy. Even has the university now, again, thanks to the collaboration with the university here. And the mayor has done a remarkable job keeping body and soul together. I don't know how, in that political climate, how he keeps his job, but he manages. He's pretty savvy. Mayor Proch, but he's done marvelous things under his leadership with that city. And there are things that I don't know if you have time for one of the stories from when we went there with the delegation. They love good food, oof, and they love vodka. Which is not all bad. But we had a huge banquet celebrating the Articles of Sister Cityhood, and this gentleman came up to me and he said, through the interpreter, I'd like to show you where I work. He said, I'd love to see it. Love to see it. Where do you work? He says, well, I work at the communication center. Okay, that sounds great. I said, how do we do that? Should we do that tomorrow? No. Tonight we go. Okay, I mean, now it's 10 o'clock, and already, and it's, of course, there's no street lights. And he says, go back to the Dubna Hotel. My driver will come by and pick you up. And his name is Victor. So when Victor comes, says, so we were out front, and Victor comes, and we got in this automobile, and again you go veering across the city, and we're leaving Dubna, and I'm thinking, hope this is the right Victor, and I don't know where we're going, but we go out in the country, and you come to this high chain link fence with barbed wire at the top, and huge discs out there. I mean, 30-meter discs aimed at the sky, satellite. And we drive up there's no gate. So we drive up to the fence, and all of a sudden there's this kind of click, and the fence just comes apart, and we drive in. I'm thinking, oh my God, we're going to be in a gulag. We have no business here. Where is he taking us? Took us to this big block building, and you walk in, and there's nothing but light down a hall, 2 or 3 little lights, and Victor says, go down there. Okay, so we went down there, and we opened this. We knocked on the door, and nothing happened. So we opened the door, and you're flooded with light, and this entire wall, which must have been 40, 50 meters long, huge wall, with this big sine wave across it with lights going across it, a map of the world, a Mercator kind of display. And here's Sergei, proud. Dobro Pajalovic, welcome. So we felt, whew, well, we're not going to be shot. And he toured the place and was taking us through the room, and here's these bays of huge computers. And I just knew we had no business there. And he says, Michael, here's this one computer, all red, just red. The others are all kind of computer colored, dark, brown, black. He says, Michael, red phone. He said, nah, he's blowing smoke at us. You know, he's inflating his importance. No, that was a computer that connected Washington with Moscow. And so I was very happy to kind of vacate that room. And then he pulled this huge console in front of him and sat down and he says, here's where I work. And this huge console with all kinds of gadgets. It looked like a sound guy that has all these things. And he says, Michael, what's your phone number? And so I launch into this explanation. Well, Sergey, in the U.S. we have area codes, and there's a code to get to the U.S. which is 1. And Michael, I know about your codes. What is your phone number? It was like, come on, give me. So I told him. He dialed it up. He says, pick up the phone. I pick up the phone, talk to Shannon, who was at home. I said, Shannon, you are not going to believe this. And we have not had too much vodka. You just won't believe what happened, and tried to explain to her. And that was one of our intros to Dubna. Sergey was so proud of what he did. And so on the one hand, militarily, Russia was top dog. Communications, top dog with us. I mean, infrastructure of the city, shot. So it was an incredible contrast, but that's the genuine friendship that was developed just like that, which was remarkable. Because our picture was of the stern Russian frowning, and a couple of our dear friends tried to portray that. They'd come on very stern, Michael, and then they'd laugh because they knew that was our impression of the Russian man, that he was ominous and foreboding, and they were puppy dogs, just dear, dear friends.
Sounds like a wonderful experience.
Oh, it was amazing.
I know Maureen quite well.
Oh.
Of course, she's worked with Sandy for years.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, mercy.
Well, we'll move on a little bit to some of your awards, many awards. You were the Emerald Ball, King and Queen,
Yes, yeah.
and strong supporters and advocates for the foundation. Tell us why you contribute as you do.
Well, CMN does wonderful things for kids and their families, and have believed in it since its inception. And hopefully it will live on forever to serve kids. And the folks that work with it, that administer the CMN and decide where the funds go and how they're spent, are incredibly conscientious and do just the very best for kids. Again, an interesting story. Initially, when CMN came, the thought was just whatever funds are raised, just throw it into the general fund and we'll sort out what. We said, no. It's not going to get lost in the budget of Lutheran Hospital. Those funds are earmarked for children. What you do with the rest of the budget, I don't care. But those monies are sacrosanct. They go for kids and their families, and that actually is different than most CMN hospitals across the country. Now, obviously, when they're children's hospitals, it's easy. but where there are so many people competing for budgetary monies. In general hospitals, it's not always the case. So we're very fortunate that CMN has maintained that priority.
Additionally, you've received, among others, the Golden Apple Award for Excellence in Pediatric Teaching and the Miracle Makers Award from the CMN Telethon. What do these awards and the many others that you've received mean to you?
The Golden Apple Award was really very special because that was when we had a pediatric residency, and that was an award given by the pediatric residents to someone they felt was the teacher of that year, and so that meant a whole lot to me. And one of my disappointments here was the loss of the pediatric residency. We could support 2 residents at each level, but the academicians decided that residency programs in pediatrics needed to be bigger, and we could not justify getting bigger given the number of patients we had, and so we made that painful decision. Even though our residents passed their boards, it wasn't a quality issue. So it was an academic decision that unfortunately shortchanged us, and so we made a painful decision that we have to end the residency.
How long did it go on?
Oh boy, that's a good question. You know, I'm not sure how many years. In fact, one of our early residents was Mike Ebersol, who's now a neurosurgeon. No, I'm not sure how many years it was. I just don't know.
I don't remember if it was active during my tenure either, which would have been 85 to 99. Don't recall myself.
I don't know if you, let's see. Boy, I just don't recall the years. They go by in a hurry.
That had to be a tough decision.
Yeah, that was tough for the department too, because we all loved the aspect of teaching, and it keeps you sharp if you have to teach someone.
That was my next question: is did the medical education and research components of Gunderson enhance your experience and your practice here?
Oh, yeah, without a doubt. And of course, the champion of that was Ed Overholt. And interestingly enough, you know, that too is another story. When I was in the Air Force, I went to Fitzsimmons for some additional training. Even though I was in the Air Force, they sent me to an Army hospital. And there I met Colonel Ed Overholt, who was one of the few internists who was conversant in pediatrics. I thought, wow, that's pretty cool. Even though Dan Plunkett was head of pediatrics at the time. Isn't that interesting? And during my stay, Dr. Plunkett said, would you like, I'm going to a retirement party. Why don't you come along with me? So I went along with him. And this retiring colonel was extolling the virtues of this place that he was going to be director of medical education. And it sounded like a really nifty place. And then I forgot about that. And then when I came to interview at the Gunderson Clinic at the home of Ralph Slungard, I met Ed Overholt. I said, I know you. I know you. He said, yeah, I've seen you before. And we recollected that we'd first crossed paths at Fitzsimmons. And Ed, he was a star when it came to medical education. He worked hard at being conversant in pediatrics, and that wasn't easy for everyone, because there were a lot of folks that that's kind of part of their medical education they kind of give away. And he had this uncanny ability to promote the fact that unless you plan to do something with the information you're about to get, whether it's the lab or exam or otherwise, if you don't have a plan for what you're going to do with it, don't do it. Don't do it. It's a waste if you are not going to use that information. Because it was an era when things were starting to be, and had been for some time, blanketed. Well, when you come in, you get this whole bay of tests, go to X-ray, and then you get this and look at it and try to make sense out of what's going on, rather than being focused and say, after my history and after my physical exam, here's what I'm concerned about. And the things that will enhance my information regarding that are these three things. The rest can go by the wayside. I don't need those. But these will be instructive. And Ed held all of our feet to the fire, which I admired. That was, and especially since you tried not to draw more blood from kids than you had to. It didn't particularly please them. And as I had mentioned before, with the newborn, they were just disenfranchised because so many of the tests required so much blood, you couldn't do it. And so with the advent of microtechniques, that was a godsend.
Thinking back to your tenure at Gunderson, what would your colleagues say that you are known for?
Well, you probably never quite satisfied, always pushing for something. Whether it's nurse practitioners or something. There's something out there that is going to make it better for children.
What would you like yourself to be known for? Or what would you really be known for?
Well, that's embarrassing without being a narcissist, you know. I've always been blessed with manifold interests. And as I mentioned to you before, one of the bits of advice from my dad was, don't retire from something, retire to something. And the things to which you could retire have always been so manifold for me and frustrating, because in the midst of working, they were always on the back burner. And I've been blessed to have been able to get to retirement and be in fairly decent health, and to be able to approach those things that I also love. And I remember what one person said, who will go unnamed. He said, "You're really a Renaissance man." He says, "Your interests are so varied." And they said that during the time that I was doing the design work for converting our barn to a home. And he just shook his head, marveled at that. And to me, it was second nature. You just do it. It's probably a tribute to my engineering genes.
Well, you hear about folks that retire that are just lost in some ways.
That's sad.
Because
it's so sad, yeah.
You know, I'll probably remember what your father said, you know, as I continue on with my life, because I think it's good advice. If you don't have something else that occupies your time,
sure, then
what do you do when you find yourself out of the workplace?
Yeah, exactly. It's you're right. There are too many people that just flounder, which is so foreign to me. Mm-hmm.
Do you have a favorite story about Gunderson best day, worst day, a patient that is memorable?
Boy, there are a lot that are memorable. I remember one of the toughest times was probably the second year I was here. A young boy from Prairie du Chien who had neuroblastoma, and during his course, it became evident that he was going to die. And to have to tell his parents broke my heart. And yet, in his last couple of days, his parents and I, we were all in tears at his bedside. And he looked up at me and he says, "Dr. Hartigan, it's okay. I'm ready to die." Great lesson.
Isn't that an unusual disease for somebody that's younger?
Well, it's one of the vicious tumors of childhood, not so much infancy.
Okay.
It can occur then, but through childhood, neuroblastoma is one of the nasty, bad operators. Yeah.
Is there ever a chance for a good recovery?
Yeah. Yeah. Especially now. In fact, there's a spot on TV now relative to St. Jude's Hospital that is about a young boy who had neuroblastoma, but it's an ordeal. You know, people that children and families that can undergo and tolerate the ordeal through which they must go to survive. Man, that's admirable. Chemotherapy and radiation is not kind. And it's interesting because when you reach the age where I am, that you start asking yourself, you know, what's the balance between time and quality? Which is another good reason for people to have advanced directives. Stay in control of what happens. Yeah.
Any advice or words of wisdom for younger physicians entering the field of pediatrics today?
Oh, yeah. Basically, if it's not your passion, if you don't love it, do something else. Do something that you will love enough to be so good at that you can look back and say, "Oh, yeah, this was what I needed to do."
When in the course of medical school do you think that you find or know what it is that you want to specialize in?
It's kind of a crapshoot. As an example, I went to med school in my naivety. I told you the story of Bobby, but thinking I'm going to be a surgeon. It's tough on camera. I have to be a little careful of my language because in med school I ran into the meanest, most unpleasant people that I could imagine that happened to be in the surgery department. They were mean, they were vindictive, they weren't too bad on students, but they were vicious on residents. Not always in a teaching way, just as a put down. I thought, oh man, if that's how you behave when you're a surgeon, man, I don't want any part of it. I'll die 1,000 deaths and I'll starve to death. Well, to show you how naive you are, and you're so occupied during medical education, you know, then I both in the Air Force and came here and met some of the most gracious people in the world that happened to be surgeons. So it was a kind of but it influences you when you're in training. because you're struggling. What am I going to do with my life? And am I doing the right thing? Never knowing that you're really being guided, but not by them, but by your history, by your past. But then I mentioned I met Bob Shapiro. He was the finest gentleman who was so astute in his observation and kindness in his approach, and open with families. I said, wow. And when he told me he had gone to Columbus Children's, that he, out of courtesy, he said, I just want you to go there for an interview, just out of courtesy to me. I said, Bob, I'll do that, but you know, I'm going a lot of other places and looking. And of course, once I did, I never looked back. But he was a real mentor for me, and unfortunately died several years ago.
Anything else that you'd like to share?
No, I guess a little bit before I got out of healthcare, but the other big passion for me has been the theater.
Yes. Tell us about that.
Well, again, as a kid, my folks always took me to the theater and symphony and so on. And I can still remember the emotion when I would go to the theater, even from a little kid. Not so much admiring what they did. I remember that feeling sitting there and saying, I want to do that. My dad was an accomplished musician who his professor from Kansas State called his dad my pops. You become pops when you're a grandfather in the Hartigan family. And he said, I think your son has a great future in music. I think he should change the music school. And Pops, half in seriousness, half in jest, said, if I thought my son was going to be a professional musician, I'd break his arm. So Dad dutifully became the engineer, but always loved music. Well, I could hear my dad never said that, and he wouldn't, but I could hear my pops saying, you think you want to be theatrical? You got to be crazy. I'll break something. But, well, so you gave that up. Happened to be, when I moved to West Salem, a neighbor of Bob Joyce, who was, again, head of the theater department at UWL. And he and I were sharing growing up and our hopes and aspirations, and I shared that story with him. I said, you know, theater has always been. He said, okay. So one day I was in my office and I got a call. And Bob and I had a relationship kind of like Don Rickles. We just loved to wail on each other. He called up and said, Michael, I want you to come to the theater to read. He said, I know how to read. I don't need to come to the theater. He said, oh, you don't understand anything. I said, why do you want me to read? Well, he knew he had to lie through his teeth to get me over there. So he said, listen, we're reading Shakespeare, and I want my class to hear another adult voice to read Shakespeare as it should be read. I said, all right, I'll come. So we went, and you approach it, and here we are on stage with this long cafeteria table and all these students sitting there, and Bob at the head of the table, and we're reading Macbeth. It was strange that he always had me reading King Duncan. Well, unknown to me, he was casting the show. So that was the first thing I got to do, and at that point, it was magic to see the empty stage, the cafeteria table, and then with struggling through lines, gradually giving up your script, getting blocking, having blocking change, and then the scenery comes in, and then you go to the costume shop and they fit you. This magic happens. Over 6 weeks, it's magic. And so that was my entree. And then a year later, I had the dream of a lifetime. Bob called me and said, we're doing Camelot, and I'd like you to do Arthur. Phew. I said, you have to be kidding me. I said, I love that show, but I could never, you know, that's incredible memorization. And he said, I don't want to hear about it. So I had the opportunity to do Camelot, and there was one other lesson at that point. There is no feeling like the feeling before the curtain goes up for a musical when the overture starts. I mean, that's a rush like you can't believe. It's excitement, it's fear, it's joy, it's hope that I hope that they'll go with us on this tale that we're about to weave. And another member of the theater department, Dick Tinnap, was also a professor of theater. Taught me a good lesson. He said, you can only ask one thing out of an audience. One thing and one thing only. He said, just come with me. Just come with me and believe. And so he'd sit out in the audience and during rehearsal, and invariably, sooner or later, one of the students, he'd say, stop, 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 stop. And things would come to a halt. And he says, all he'd say was, I don't believe it. I don't believe it. And of course, this student would bite every time. You'd hear it coming, because I'd heard it before. He'd say, Dr. Tinnap, what would you like me to do? Something different. So what he was saying was, I don't want you doing Dr. Tinnap doing that role. I want you to find that role. And that was a great lesson. And then the whole business of believing, after Camelot, the closing curtain, you're just exhausted. And most of the cast are in tears at the end of that show, sending the boy off to be the future. And we go down to the dressing room, and that's down below the stage at UWL. And the real theater folks go down to talk to the cast and congratulate us on. People came down there, and there were still tears. We said, yes, that's what it's all about. They believed. Mm-hmm. That's all you can ask, and they believed. And then you're hooked. Jeez, it was, yeah. Then there's a few favorites I've done, but the father in Diary of Anne Frank was a powerful role.
Golden Pond, you were...
Oh, on Golden Pond, Norman, yeah. That was the one where I really was worried about the memorization, because I was 72 at the time. And that was a real worry, and even right up to opening night. Yeah, but that's part of the rush. Movies, I can take or not, and I expect movies to be perfect. Live theater, I love it because it's the risk. Something's different every night, and it's risky, and that's probably why I was in intensive care. You know, you like being out there at the edge. Kind of an adrenaline junkie. Yeah.
Anything else?
No, I've been very fortunate, and I know that. I love these years to approach those things that I really love. And it's in 2008, I was the Riverfest Commodore, and so you get to be visible down at Riverfest, and to have the kids come back and say, you took care of me back in so-and-so, or the parents to come up and say, thank you, all worthwhile, all worthwhile.